But this Sunday, I also find myself locked in a love-hate relationship with our gospel. I don't know if you ever feel like that when you read the Bible. Hopefully you do. But this morning, I both love and I hate our gospel. I love the story that it tells. It really reveals things about us, about God, and about faith that I think we need to listen to and pay attention to, but I come really close to hating Jacob in our story. He is a self-centered, cunning liar and a cheat, which, not coincidentally, is actually what his name means. I hope none of you know anyone named Jacob, because Jacob actually means heel in Hebrew. The tricky, cunning, fighting one. You know when we call someone a heel? That's what the name Jacob means. But to really hear the struggle of our gospel text this morning, to feel those bodies that were clashing together all night long, to smell the sweat that came streaming down their faces, and then to feel our own panting breath, to take our place in this story of struggle and desperation in the darkness, we need to know a little bit more about how we and how Jacob got to this place where he wrestled with a mysterious man all night long. How he arrived at the fight club of the Old Testament. Because really you never enter into a struggle like Jacob encounters in our gospel without some baggage, without some history that propelled you there. Last week we heard God promise to Sarah that she would have a son. It was a promise she couldn't believe and that she laughed at. But she was 90 years old and she was supposed to have a child. But Jacob, the heel, is the son of that impossible child of Abraham and Sarah. He is the son, along with his twin brother Esau, of Isaac and his wife Rebekah. Isaac was born to Abraham and Sarah. Jacob and his older twin brother Esau, they never, ever got along. They fought each other even when they were nestled inside of Rebekah's womb. It was so bad that she was afraid that she would die from the pain of their fighting. And then when they came out of that womb, Jacob was grabbing onto his brother's heel and wouldn't let him go. Which is how Jacob got his name, the heel. And a sign that their fight was just beginning. As they got older and became adults, Jacob came into his own. He tricked his older brother Esau into selling him his inheritance for a pot of stew because Esau was hungry. And then in what would be his final trick that would get him booted out of the house, Jacob dressed up like his hairy older brother and connived their father into giving him, the younger son, that important traditional blessing that's usually given to the oldest child. And Esau, his twin brother, not surprisingly, finally has enough of this liar and this cheat Jacob and sets out to kill his twin brother. But staying true to his name as a tricky coward, Jacob flees from his home instead of facing his sins, facing his brother. But today in our gospel reading, we meet Jacob again 15 years later, after he's fled from home, after he went to live with his mother's family. after he married 2 sisters, had more children than he could fit in a minivan, and then accumulated wealth like Donald Trump does. But once again, he's pulled too many tricks. Once again, he gets run out of town. And God comes and tells him to go back home, where he was kicked out of town before. I don't like Jacob. He has every sin and self-centeredness that I like to pick out and then despise in other people. Which usually means when that happens that that sin that I'm picking on is something that I am guilty of myself. He has prospered through deceit. He never ever thinks he has done anything wrong. He never apologizes. And instead of facing up to what he has done to people, to his very own family, he runs away every time instead. I sure wish his story wasn't included in the Bible. But thankfully God has a different perception of God's children than I do. Or than any of us probably have, because today in our gospel text, God goes to work on Jacob. And Jacob is forced to face his biggest fears. He is forced to face himself, his past, and who he truly is. For Jacob has been told that his brother Esau is coming out to meet him as he travels home, and he's bringing with him 400 of his strongest men. So Jacob does what Jacob does best. He finds a way around the problem. He splits up his herds of sheep, his servants, and his family, and he sends half of them off to hide in the hills so that Esau won't find them. And he sends the other half ahead of him in waves to meet Esau, to try to buy him off, to appease his twin brother so that maybe, just maybe, he won't kill him. And then Jacob is left alone for the night. Alone with himself. Alone with his past. Alone with his fears. And alone with his God. And he's about to go through what we don't talk about enough in the church. For on this night, when Jacob is alone for one of the very first times in his life, Jacob endures what often happens to us when we are left alone with ourselves, with our fears, with our past, and with God. But Jacob wrestles, and sweats, and bleeds, and grunts, and pants, and struggles all night long with a mysterious man. We don't know if this mysterious man was just a stranger. Some people have thought he was an angel from God. Some people think it is God himself. Some people think it was Jacob, his own inner demons. And that's why that struggle that goes on all night long, when Jacob won't let go of the man and the man won't let go of Jacob, is why I love this story, even though I really dislike Jacob. Because it makes real and it brings to light our own struggles, our own sufferings, our own doubts, our dark night of the soul that we most often don't share with other people. But that struggle might happen all night long. It might happen for 20 years. It is a part of faith. Perhaps to wrestle with God is even a sign of a deep down gritting wrestling with your real self-faith that is true faith. So this morning, I want you to hear from another of our Christian brothers who has struggled with faith and struggled with himself. We're going to watch a little video of the story of entering into the darkness with yourself and with God. You're going to hear in a little bit from a man named Parker Palmer. He is a respected teacher and author in the Quaker tradition. I'm going to set up on the screen. Just 1 second. Look at that. Ushers, turn off the lights. That would be helpful.
What do you mean by being forced underground? that we need to go down and in and through?
Well, my famous story about that one, to me, in the context of my life, is a story I tell in Let Your Life Speak about being on Outward Bound at age 40-something, and being on Hurricane Island off the coast of Maine and facing this challenge that I had most feared on the Outward Bound program, which was rappelling down a 100-foot cliff. I'm not an athlete. I don't deal easily with heights. And suddenly I'm being forced to make what seemed to me like a death-defying descent down a very rugged rock wall. Well, without going into all the details, I will say that there came a moment in this descent at about the midpoint where I simply froze in fear. I could no longer move my hands, and I was suspended there. And I had no idea what to do. It was clear nobody was going to haul me up, nobody was going to lower me down. The whole thing was up to me, and I just hung there for what seemed like an eternity until finally this young woman who was one of our instructors down below, there was another one up top, said, "Is anything wrong, Parker?" I mean, looking back, I know that there must have been a little humor in that. But I said in this childlike voice that came from God knows where inside of me, "I don't want to talk about it." She said, "Well, then it's time for you to learn the Outward Bound motto." And she said, "The Outward Bound motto is, if you can't get out of it, get into it." And for reasons I can't explain, those words just bypassed my argumentative mind and went right into my body and my heart. I mean, the truth of them was undeniable. And I started moving. And I made it down without further difficulty. I got into it. And I remember I was at Pendle Hill, the Quaker community at the time, and I came back to this life together with 80 people, and I just thought, you know, on Outward Bound, we could all see what people were struggling with. The struggles were external and visible, and those 10 people were so supportive of each other. If only we could see what it is that other people, what it is that people in this community are struggling with. If only that were more visible to us. If only we could hear people saying, "I don't want to talk about it." If only we could help them understand that if you can't get out of it, you need to get into it. What a stronger and deeper community this would be. So when I've come across my own equivalents of being suspended in the middle of that rappel, things like trying to take on a book on democracy at age 65 when I'm in the middle of a clinical depression and I've lost faith in myself as a writer, and I'm experiencing some of the symptoms of aging, the inability to multitask as much as I used to do, the inability to remember what I read yesterday as clearly as I used to do, just the lack of energy to do all the things that I'm asked to do. I'm wondering, can I write another book? I know that the only way to get out of it is to get into it. The only way to deal with the darkness is not to try to walk around it or turn your back on it or pretend it isn't there, but to go deeper into it until you start to see a little bit of light and a little bit more light. It took me 7 years to write the book. Finding the light didn't happen quickly or easily. But I'm awfully glad for that Outward Bound experience, which gave me guidance in that moment.
had one other point. To deal with the darkness isn't to pretend it isn't there or to walk around it, but to go into it until you start to see a little bit of light. I don't think Jacob would have wrestled with himself if he wasn't stuck by the river all night long by himself. And he couldn't get out of it. So he had to go into it. And when morning came, when the sunlight started to peek through his darkness and he could see glimmers of light, Jacob was given a new name. After facing his past, after struggling with himself and with his demons and with God, he would be the heel no longer. For that man who struggled with him renamed him and gave him a blessing and called him Israel, the one who wrestles with God, the one who is able. And so I invite you this week, this night, this month, that when you can't get out of it, go into it. When the night comes, when the mysterious man comes and wrestles with you out of nowhere, know that God is with you in the darkness, in the struggle, and will stay there with you until God can bring you that blessing and call you by a new name, the one who struggles with God, my child and my beloved, so that then you can walk faithfully into the future, into the light